Our new topic for today is about sin. What is it? And this is part one. Right now, we are in this world, in our old self, and God wants us to be with Him in heaven. So He created us to be with Him in heaven. This is the will of God. So that God wills us that we reach our perfect self, wherein we are united with Him in heaven. So God's will is that we be united with Him in heaven. We have to understand this so that later when we discuss about sin, uh, we we will have better grasp of what sin is. If we just follow God's will, then we will surely get to heaven. God created us to be with Him in heaven. He He wants us to be with Him. He is doing His best so that we will be with Him in heaven. So if we just follow God's will, we will surely get to heaven. In Matthew 7, verse 21, obeying God's will is so important that Jesus said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven." Many of us are familiar with this phrase, but we forget that this is not yet the complete sentence. So let's find out what the complete sentence is, and we will see how this sentence is connected to the will of God. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So only those who follow the will of the Father in heaven will enter the kingdom of heaven. That is how important following God's will is. So, as long as we follow God's will, we will reach our destiny. And this is God's plan for all of us. But sad to say, when we decide to follow our own pathway, we end up in our fallen self. We are not able to reach our perfect self, but we end up in our fallen self. This is because we we went out and go out against the will of God. And therefore, our first understanding of sin is that sin is against God's will. When we commit sin, we are going against God's will because we have chosen a pathway for ourselves that is not the will of God. In the Bible, we have another meaning for sin. Sin, the Hebrew word for sin is kata, which means missing the mark or goal. The Greek word for sin is hamartia. This means missing the mark or the goal. So if our goal is to be with God in heaven, sin is we have missed the mark. We are not able to reach our goal to be with God in heaven. And that is the meaning of sin in Bible. So another meaning of sin is that it is failure to hit the mark. We are unable to be with God in heaven. What does it take to be? What is in this journey that we have to do? We have to love God and we have to love our neighbor. That is what it takes to be in this journey to reach our goal. But some people do not do this. They don't love God and neighbor. Instead, they end up with failing to love God and failing to love neighbor, which is also the summary of uh, what the Ten Commandments is asking us to do. And the reason why they fail to love God and fail to love neighbor is because of wrong self-love. The love that is supposed to be for God and neighbor is directed towards self. So what is sin? Sin is an act that is against God's will, and the first creature that have disobeyed God and went up against God's will is the devil himself. And when we commit sin, we are just like repeating what the devil has done in from the beginning. And because of that, you will miss the goal because you fail to do God's will. Now, we have here a question: are all sins equal? Yes or no? Which is the answer? Which is true? Yes or no? Let's find out. In John 19, verse 11, Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore the one who has handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." So we have here the answer to the question that not all sins are equal. There are sins that are great and there are lesser sins. So the more serious sins, we have a term for that. We call that mortal sins. While the less serious sins are what we call venial sins. Another question: are mortal and venial sins in the Bible? In 1 John chapter 5 verse 16 to 17, if anyone sees his brother commit a sin that does not lead to death, he should pray and God will give him life. I refer to those sins that does not lead to death. There is a sin that leads to death. I am not saying that he should pray about that. All wrongdoing is sin, and there is a sin that does not lead to death. This sin that does not lead to death, or what we understand as spiritual death, a sin that does not lead to spiritual death, our term for that is venial sin. So venial sin is just a term for what we call the sins that does not lead to spiritual death. How about mortal sin? There is a sin that leads to death. There is a sin that leads to spiritual death. And our term for that is mortal sin because it leads us to spiritual death. Now, let's give a more detailed definition of venial and mortal. Venial is a lesser offense because it does not constitute a complete and direct refusal of the will of God. Mortal sin is a serious offense against God, and it constitutes three elements. So these three elements must be present in order for us to categorize the sin as mortal sin. These three elements are grave matter, perfect knowledge, and full consent. In grave matter, the sin should be serious. Example, breaking the Ten Commandments. Oh, perfect knowledge is you know very well that what you are doing is a sin. Full consent is that even though you know that it is bad, it is a sin, you still willingly went on and did the act itself. So that's full consent. If you have these three elements, then what you did is a mortal sin. So if we look at this drawing, on the left side, the person there is in a state of grace. He is still united with God. When you have venial sin, the one in the middle, you are the sin is does not totally separate you from God. But in mortal sin, you are the one who separated yourself away from God. And that is what happened. That is what is happening in mortal sin. So sin separates you from God. Now, God, well, through His mercy, will give you grace if you ask for His forgiveness through confession and through baptism. He will give you His grace. Grace unites you with God. So, in this new drawing, in this new diagram, you have here two areas. The one in the gray below is a shaded gray area, and this is where the devil is, because from the beginning he already went up against God's will. He has no sanctifying grace. Now, you are uh, not in this place. You are on the lighter area in this drawing, because you have sanctifying grace. You have been baptized and you have received this sanctifying grace. And as long as you are doing God's will, you remain there. But when you commit mortal sin, you will lose your sanctifying grace, and you will separate yourself from God, and you will be in this gray area, and you will be with the devil, and you are already forming relationship with the devil. This is what happens to you when you commit a mortal sin. You separate yourself from God, and you end up together in this side with the devil. So when you commit sin, a demon attaches to you. If it has been a year since your last confession, then probably there are already many demons that are attached to you. So every time you commit mortal sins, demons become attached, or you have formed relationships with the devil. So if it has been over 10 years that you have 10, 20, or 30 years that you have not yet confessed, then maybe there are already hundreds or thousands of demons that are attached to you, or you have many relationships with demons, and it will be harder for you to come back on your own, and that would uh, take help from God. You need God to help you. Now, in this new diagram, we can see that as long as you have this sanctifying grace, when death comes to you, when you die, you will go to heaven. Now, the opposite happens when you have no sanctifying grace, when you have committed mortal sin and you have no sanctifying grace. You will have spiritual death. You are still alive, but you already are spiritually dead. And what is waiting for you in the next life is not heaven anymore. It is hell. And so when death comes to you, you will end up in hell. So how do I know if the sin I have committed is mortal sin? So again, the three elements, grave matter, full knowledge, and full consent. If all these three elements are present, then you have committed mortal sin. So a way to understand this is that these factors in the left side can affect the severity or the gravity of the sin that you have committed. It makes it less serious now, or if you have little knowledge or without full consent, then it lessens the gravity of the sin. But if you have full knowledge, full consent, and more serious sins, then that makes the sin or the act as a serious offense against God. So let's give some examples for students out there. If you are about to take the exam and you have difficulty answering the test paper, so the devil who has not yet have any relationship with you, he will offer you a gift in the form of a temptation. He wants to establish a relationship with you. So he gives you this gift in the form of a temptation. And if you accept this temptation, that means you already start a relationship with the devil. If you accept this temptation, that means that you are already starting a relationship with the devil. So disobeying God, sin is to choose oneself over God. So this is another understanding of sin. Sin is to choose oneself over God. Remember that only God is good and the source of all good. Evil is the absence of good. So to choose oneself over God is to ignore Him and His will. Wrong self love leads to self destruction and self inflicted death. There are two kinds of self love: wrong self love and the correct self love. A wrong self love leads to self destruction and self inflicted death. So that ends my first part of the topic about sin. So I hope you have learned a lot, and hopefully you also go and listen to the second part of the discussion about sin. Thank you.